Hey everybody, I'm Quentin Kopp. For those of you who have not met me physically or ethereally as we are tonight, before, I'm chair of the society and son of George Kopp, who many of you will have read about in Homish, Catalonia. I'm delighted to introduce you to Steve Wadhams tonight and Chris Angel, who put together what I'm sure you will appreciate as a very special presentation tonight, which will capture some knowledge and incidents and what have you that have not been recorded before, and will form another part of the expanding record of what's important about George Orwell and his life and works. So if I could hand over to you, Steve and Chris. Steve Wadhams was a journalist with the Canadian Broadcasting Commission, the equivalent of our BBC, and Chris is he's based in Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. Chris Angel is a filmmaker who some of you may remember was on with David Milton when he gave his talk in the autumn last year, and together they have produced tonight's talk. So over to you, Chris and Steve. Thank you very much indeed for presenting this to us.
Thank you, Quentin, and thank you, Neil, for organizing these. So my name is indeed Christopher Angel, and as Quentin pointed out, I'm a filmmaker and a screenwriter based here in Los Angeles. Although for tonight's proceedings, I would like to lump myself in with the very active and very polite Canadian members of the Orwell Society. And as many of you know, I'm working to adapt Professor Peter Stansky's biographies of Orwell into a limited series for television or streaming. So let me start our presentation if I can, so I can get the technology to work. Let's see here. A second while I get this full screen for you. And do one more attempt. And is that a full screen picture?
It is now, thanks, Chris.
All right, fantastic. So, so I am incredibly interested in the work of our guest, Steve Wadhams, for many reasons. I grew up in Toronto, Canada, listening to the amazing radio documentaries that Steve created on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. It was how I learned about the broader world. And I was very lucky to spend the last year in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, where Steve now lives, and to have the distinct pleasure of talking to him a lot about his experiences and his methodology for storytelling. And for one of his biggest and most important documentaries, called George Orwell, A Radio Biography, he traveled to London and Spain in 1983 and interviewed many of the people who knew Orwell firsthand. Besides creating this radio documentary, he published a book based on his interviews called Remembering Orwell, as well as made his surviving original audio interviews available to the Society membership on a USB stick, which is still available to you. So for today's talk, rather than go over the same ground that is on those tapes or in the book, I'm going to ask Steve to focus on the context of his interviews and to talk most importantly about his process for creating his documentary, and to set the scene, as much as one can remember after 30 years, of where he met people and what it was like to meet them. And I'm hoping here to record, as Quentin pointed out, record some material and thoughts and experiences that are not available elsewhere. So let's see if I can advance the slide. So Steve, can you tell us first what it meant to be a radio documentary producer for the CBC in the 1980s?
In the 1980s, it was a period when we were actually quite well off for cash. Certain programs had got quite a decent budget, and that enabled us to make documentaries by traveling all over the world. The program was actually called Sunday Morning, the main one. It was a 3-hour morning show. And typically we had about 12 producers, and we were a bit like Spitfire pilots in a way. We would be sent out on missions to get documentaries which ranged from topical news-based current affairs pieces to sometimes we would be away for a couple of weeks or maybe 3 to do a much longer feature. it was an incredible learning experience for me. I mean, this slide that's up right now, shall I talk about that for a moment, Chris?
Yes, please.
This slide here was taken in 1980 in Lesotho, up in the high mountains of Lesotho, which, as you can see by the clothes, is pretty cold even in the summer. I'm recording it with a guy who he told me he was selling his ox in order to raise school fees, and it was a wonderful interview. It was part of a much larger 20-hour special on Africa, which we called Africa Week. And I was entrusted with doing the whole evening, 4-hour evening on Southern Africa, because I'd spent many, many years, the last 10 years or so, specializing in Africa, having lived there for a couple of years in Malawi in the early 70s doing schools broadcasting, and then going back to the Rhodesian Civil War, Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, as it became, in the late 70s, covering those rough times of decolonization, and also basically traveling and working in nearly every country, from, if you drew a line from Namibia across to Kenya, all the way South Africa, Lesotho, Malawi, Swaziland, Mozambique, Zambia, Uganda. I was in Uganda when Amin was thrown out. So I'd had about 10 to 12 years of experience making documentaries by the time I got to do the Orwell project in 1983.
And what were your duties as a documentary producer? What does that mean for what you did for your work? You're obviously here recording the interview. What else did you do?
Yeah, well, in the radio documentary world, I mean, you're on your own, basically. Television's different. You hunt in packs of 2 or 3 or 4. But with radio, you are your own person. So you have to do your own research. You have to do your own interviewing, your own recording, your own editing, scripting, and usually voicing too, and mixing these days now that we have digital multitrack. We don't even have to use a technician in the studio anymore. So it's actually very, the thing is, if the thing is yours, you make something every time. And if it's good, it's yours. And if it's terrible, it's yours. So there's no hiding behind it. So it sharpens the mind, actually. And it suited me to do this, just to be out on the road on your own, making all your own decisions and making all your own mistakes, and making something that you feel proud of or not at the end of the day. Yeah.
And how did you come up with the idea to do a special documentary on George Orwell?
Well, the idea was thanks to Bernard Crick, frankly. I had just got his biography of Orwell in, I think, the spring of '82. I got it at an airport bookshop. I was on my way to Ottawa from Toronto to do a current affairs story. And I started flicking through the pages, and I basically was immediately captivated by this. And I thought that there's got to be a radio documentary here, which would take us to all the places that Orwell had been and hopefully hear the voices of people who knew him. Bernard Crick was actually my politics professor at Sheffield University in '65, '68. He taught the first year politics students. And so I remember him as a professor at first, of course, and then it was interesting to get his book and discover that he had done the official biography of Orwell, which I hadn't known up till that point.
Thank you. So, Steve, if you could sort of tell us a little bit about what it was you're producing, the difference between the radio biography you produced, which I think was a 5-hour biography, and then what is available to people today, either those raw interviews or what's on the CBC website right now.
Yes, the 5-hour biography, the one that was broadcast on January the 1st, 1984, has all the clips, the interviews, the voices of the people who knew Orwell, of course, as its main thrust. The narrator is one of Orwell's friends and a writer of many, many books, George Woodcock, the late George Woodcock, he wrote a book called The Crystal Spirit, as I'm sure you know, which I think is a wonderful book on Orwell. And he was my narrator. He lived in Vancouver at that time. And then the music, I was amazed to be asked if I wanted to have original music in this documentary, because it's very, very expensive. But somehow or other, the CBC had money to spend before the end of the fiscal year, I think. That was the trick. So there was money available, which had to be spent. And I was offered, would I like an orchestra, a 25-piece orchestra and a composer to create an original music score, which stunned me because I'd never had that offer before. And then in this picture here is my colleague, Edward Trapunski, who was my assistant and associate producer, who was fantastic. And the two of us basically went to work to put together George Orwell, a radio biography.
And then can you tell us how you prepared for your trip to England? So this is you in your office in Canada, I assume. But you...
Yeah, this is actually in Studio G in Toronto.
And so you were based in Toronto and you decided that you were going to go off to England and interview all these people. And you obviously knew Professor Crick, you read his book, but how did you prepare? How did you set up the interviews? What did you tell the people you were going to interview?
Right. Well, yes, I contacted Bernard Crick, and of course he may or may not have remembered me, but it was the first time I'd seen him, of course, since Sheffield days in the 60s. He was very, very helpful. He opened up his research files and gave me many, many names and addresses and phone numbers. So that was the main mother lode of material, which really, if he hadn't done that as graciously as he did, then it would have been immensely harder to make this program. Then Edward and I set to work to try it. Edward really put a lot of work into trying to track down and find other people that perhaps Bernard hadn't noticed for one reason or another. I think we probably found a dozen or so, but the main number of the interviews came from Bernard's files. In London, we were helped out immensely by the CBC London office, which was great. There was a wonderful woman called Peggy Riley who helped coordinate all the interviews. When I was out, I got to London. I was one of doing the interviews, so I went to London first and started doing about 15 or 17 interviews that were within striking distance or in London. And while that was going on, Peggy was busy lining up and getting the okays and making the arrangements for me to meet a lot of other people who I would, in Spain or in north of England or Scotland, etc. So it was really a group of, a small group of us who did the logistics, and then I would get into my car and drive and arrive at these people's houses or flats or cottages or whatever, and start recording, start interviewing.
And did you give any of them editorial control? I know you talked about your general process of often giving subjects the ability to hear their interviews later, or the edited show, I suppose, and vetoes.
Yes. Actually, yes, not in this. No, not in this case. No. Later on, I in another program, which was very, very personal. Yes, we broke the journalistic rule and gave the subject of the story, an agreement that we wouldn't broadcast stuff that they didn't want to hear. But for this, no. The normal rules applied here, that once they'd done the interview, that would, they had to trust me and trust the CBC to deal with their testimony in a fair and accurate way. And I think nobody actually complained after the fact. So, I mean, I wasn't out to ambush them. I wasn't out to embarrass them. I was just hoping to capture what they had to say about George Orwell, or Eric Blair, of course, the older ones who knew him as Eric Blair. And that was my intent, and that was really it. Pretty well all you could expect. Most of the time it was about an hour, maybe 3/4 of an hour, maybe 2 at the most, meeting these people. And, most of my task was simply to get them to say what I kind of knew they had said or mentioned in the past, and then maybe try and spin off into anything which cropped up naturally out of that interview, out of what they had said. But that was my main job, just to get them on tape.
And I'm just going to pause for 1 second for a technical question. I do hear some crackling, but is the audio coming across okay for the our viewers in their homes?
Yes, I can hear the crackling as well, Chris. I can still hear Steve all right. It's just a bit of crackling in the background, so it's fine when you're speaking. So I'm not sure if there's anything we can do about it.
Okay, as long as it's still intelligible for everybody. That's the main goal.
Okay.
And then one other question, Steve, on the interviews. I know there's a difference between North American customs for radio broadcast or journalism and England in terms of paying interview subjects. Did you come across that, and how did you respond to that?
Yeah, yes, that was a bit of a surprise. In North America, no one gets paid to do these interviews, but some of the people asked about a fee, and we said fine, not a huge amount of money. I mean, I think it was like £50 or something like that. And we just said, okay, fine. And do you want a fee? And some said yes, and some said no. And we made the payments. It was just one of the things we did. But yes, it was a little different there. The culture was a little different.
All right, so I think this is a good segue into the actual interview. So we're gonna sort of do a section here where we're gonna sort of go through some of your interviews and what you remember of them and reminiscences of them. And it's ordered roughly in the order these people knew Orwell and his life. So that's our organizing principle. And we will begin with Jane Morgan.
Yes.
So if you want to talk about giving people props, I think she might be a good one to talk about how you conducted her interview. Yes,
well, it's always good in a radio program, when you're interviewing someone, and maybe in television too, I'm sure, but it's not seen in radio. Quite commonly, people don't. I always used to try and get people to talk about something specific rather than talk in general. People, generally speaking, are happier when you ask them something. It helps them open up and talk and think when you can talk to something specific. And in Jane's case, of course, she had possession of wonderful documentary material. Ida Blair's, the mother, Eric's mother's diaries for 1912, I think it was. And of course, his letters home from St. Cyprian's, some of his letters home. So, of course, I asked her to go through the diaries, and which she did, and that gives a nice sense of presence too. When you hear someone just turning a page or reacting, as she would say, "Oh, look, there's Mrs." She says here on page on this part of the diary, "I went to Henley, or to see the regatta, or went to Wimbledon. To, oh, look, Mr. So and so won the gentlemen's singles, or Miss So and so won the ladies," and you get a picture of someone discovering something even through the documents themselves, which is lovely. It gives the listener much more sense of eavesdropping, I think, on a conversation rather than hearing it. It's a subtle difference, but in radio, if you're overhearing something, it's actually quite more tantalizing than straightforwardly hearing something. It's an odd thing, and I found that very useful. So Jane had these wonderful props, so to speak, which helped. And the letters from Eric's school, where he describes all these scientific experiments which the teacher did, and through nature walks they went on, and signing it all very formally from E.A. Blair. I guess the letters were probably censored, or at least read by the teachers, by Mrs. Wilkes. So I guess we have to look at them in that light too. But just having those documents with Jane Morgan was wonderful. She was so cheerful and so forthcoming too. She was a lovely lady. I say was, I hope, I'm not sure I should say that. But in 1983, everybody, it's a was. So yes, it was wonderful. And there's Ida Blair too, it's wonderful. Oh, and the baby Blair, she was very big on this business of him having a weak chest. The number of times the doctor had to be called to help him. I think it was bronchitis. I don't know if there's anything in the medical dictionaries called a weak chest, whether it has any relationship at all to tuberculosis, which George Orwell, of course, died of. I suspect not, but somehow or other we think that a weak chest might have been a harbinger of health issues to come.
Next person, I'm going to try to play a little snippet of your original audio that you kindly gave us. Let's see if this works.
Sense. That's the principal part of the school, and the gymnasium with the asphalt rink in front of it, where we used to do physical training. And then onto this end was built all the private quarters where Mr. and Mrs. Wilkes used to live with their family.
So yeah, that's from your archive. And again, thank you for making these available, because it does give us a sense of class, of education, of humor, personality that, you know, one doesn't quite get just from reading these things in a book. So it's an amazing resource, I think, for all of us who are interested in Orwell these days. Can you tell us, like, where did you interview Sir John? And
John Grotrian in his house, I'm pretty sure. To be honest, yes, it was in his house. Sir John was a wonderful man. He was not in great health when we did that interview. He was coughing a lot. I had to edit out a lot of his heavy coughs. And sadly, he died in February '84, which was only about 6 months or more after we'd done the interview. But at the end of the interview, he produced this booklet. It was the 1916 St. Cyprian's yearbook, I suppose, more like a prospectus, really, with those photographs. That one is one of them. There were others which showed the inside of the school. And I was stunned. It was, to this day, I'm thinking, like, why did he give me that book? And I think maybe because it's possible because he thought he wasn't going to live much longer. I don't know. And the book might just disappear with all his things, and maybe he was giving it to me because I was interested in Orwell. I really don't know. But it was a lovely gesture that he did. But I can still hear his cough, his great chesty cough. And I guess that's probably what took him away 6 or 8 months after the interview. But he was a lovely man. Sir John Grotrian.
And you still have this book. These are actually photographs I took of this book a couple of years ago when you shared it. Yeah,
yes, I have it here. Yes, when you and I met, Chris, I showed it to you, and you took pictures of the photos. Yeah.
Yeah. With those snapshots. The baths, I think, were the one. Maybe I should put that up as well. But the baths were kind of shockingly grimy.
Yeah. Oh, the bath was tiny. I mean, it was like a splash pool, really. The cold water. I mean, no, not a swimming pool. Just something you dive into in the morning in the cold water, and all before breakfast, as he said. John said. The nice thing about Sir John Grotrian also was that he hadn't read anything of Orwell. He didn't even think he said he was a very dull boy at school. And so his testimony was interesting then because he wasn't influenced by anything he'd read. He hadn't read the essay on St. Cyprian's, you know, such were the joys. So he wasn't influenced. He wasn't interested in Orwell's life at all, other than, of course, them being at school together. And he said there was no really way I could make friends with him. He was a rather dull boy. And it was so nice. Nice to meet someone who was quite honest and not at all interested in Orwell, really, but gave us something of Orwell.
That's...
All right. I'm sure many of our members are interested.
Yes.
Yes.
What a lovely picture, isn't it?
It is. What was she like to meet? What did you take away?
Oh gosh, Jacintha, well, of course, she looked a lot different from that, like as I look a lot different now from those early pictures. But she was very, very lovely, very welcoming. I wasn't sure how with anybody really, how welcoming they would be to welcome a stranger, you know, to have this guy from CBC in Canada to visit. She was very welcoming. And she also, of course, had some documents with her to read, letters that Orwell had written, and the poems. I asked her to read some of these poems that he'd written when he was a teenager to her. Clearly very sort of puppy love, perhaps. I don't know what Orwell would have been. Eric Blair would have been about 15 at the time, I think, when he and Jacintha were buddies and friends with the family, the Buddicom family. And it was very moving to hear her read. And again, you know, she had what I call the props, which were, of course, the poems, and she read the I think one of the poems talked about how fond Orwell was of, how Eric Blair wrote about how fond he was of her. And she talked about the sort of the crush she had on him, I suppose, a teenage crush. And she said, you know, but of course, he never did anything about it. He never, quote, he never tried to seduce me. And of course, I took that on face value. And then later on, much later on, she wrote her book, and people spoke about that. In fact, Orwell probably did, as a young teenager, try and, you know, get something going with young Jacintha Buddicom. So anyway, it's all in the past, but she was a very, very lovely lady. I made her cry, I'm afraid, at the very end, and I didn't mean to. When Eric, well, he'd written to her from Burma, of course, saying how horrible it was, and that was interesting to get that take on Burma. But then she'd lost touch with him. She had no idea that he had changed his name, and the pen name was George Orwell. She'd read, she discovered much later in life through her aunt that the Eric Blair, or Eric the famous writer, as he had always told her he was going to be, and she said, yes, you're going to be Eric the famous writer, that this, when 1984 was published, she discovered that was Eric Blair, that George Orwell was Eric Blair, and she was stunned. So she went back and read all these books, but the thing was, she hated 1984. She thought it was one of the most pessimistic books she'd ever read, and even though she knew that he was very, very ill in Cranham, in the TB sanatorium, you'd think she would go and visit him. But she said, well, what would I say? Was I going to tell him that I couldn't stand 1984? I thought it was a terrible, pessimistic book. No, you don't go and visit a very sick and perhaps dying man and tell him that's what you think of his masterpiece. So she didn't go. And so I said, do you regret going? And she said, and that was when she broke into tears and said that I never really treated Eric as I might have. And she was very moved by that. And so it's kind of stopped recording at that point.
Thank you for sharing. Was there anything after you stopped recording, or was that was really it?
No, she composed herself, and we just had a chat and a cup of tea or something. I got back in the car and said, thank you, and headed off to the next interview. 2 a day and a lot of driving.
Speaking of that, I will move on. So this is obviously the wall
Yes.
game at Eton, and that's your team there recording some sounds?
Yes, I was lucky. That was the one occasion when I had a technician. Probably due to strange union rules at that time. Producers, strictly speaking, weren't allowed to record what we called wild sound. Just people doing things, not actually interviewing. There was a union jurisdiction thing. So I think the reason that I was asked to take a technician with me, that would be why my colleague was there with the microphone. It's also good that he had the microphone on a long pole, which got us closer to the action, because you really want the mic to be close. So I had asked Eton College if they would stage a wall game, because I had never seen it, and I wanted the sounds of the game for the documentary, and they were very cooperative, and there you have it. Strange game, great long wall, nothing much happening, boys just pushing each other and trying to like rugby up against a wall, really. Very odd thing, very just unique to Eton. And there's the master sort of adjudicating, I guess, where the ball is, well, I guess whether it's touched the wicket or I'm not sure, I can't remember now what the rules were, but it was an odd experience, but yes, we got the sounds.
All right, I'm going to play another snippet of audio. This is from Jack Denny, who kitted out Orwell with clothing for Burma. And let's see what he has to say.
I mean, these were not the clothes of a proletarian, were they?
No, not indeed. No, they were very well turned out players. But he was one of these people that put on a suit and don't look well dressed even when they put it on new. I never really ever saw him looking smart. Not as always careless. His trousers were, well, the trousers of the day. I mean,
All right. So, so obviously you went to Southwold, and the store. This is your photograph from 1983 of the store as it existed then, and you were able to talk to Jack Denny himself, correct?
Yes.
What do you
Yes,
remember?
Jack was very helpful. Well, it was an odd interview because he had the props too. He had the order book. He kept the Denny and Company order book for 1922 and 1927, 22 when Orwell was going out to Burma, and 27, I think, when he was also getting clothes, I guess before he went out tramping. But Jack Denny, it must hurt the tailor, I think, to think that all these wonderful clothes, and they were expensive clothes that he was buying, that when Orwell put them on, or Eric Blair put them on, he would still look like he was a scarecrow, but never mind. But they were expensive. He went through and he said, you know, a pair of trousers like this today would cost, you know, so many pounds, etc., etc., and an overcoat and his right breeches, and they would cost this amount, and there were large amounts of money. I think, you know, even like what an average workman would make in a week. So Denny's take was that a lot of this, oh, we're poor, oh, I'm poor, that Orwell was going on about, was just fakery, really, that he had money. At least he did. Somebody found the money anyway to kit him out with really good stuff to go to Burma. And then, of course, you had the delightful stuff with the order book of the measurements. So he's got these, you know, I can hear him saying now, oh, yes, he was a 36 inside leg man or something like that. And you get the picture of this tall, spindly Orwell, thanks to the measurements in the order book that Denny had. And he said something which tantalized me, but it never came to anything. He said, most people unburden themselves while fitting. And I thought, oh, this is great. He's going to tell me all kinds of, he's going to unburden himself now, Jack Denny, and tell me all kinds of juicy stuff about young Eric Blair in Southwold. But unfortunately, no. I mean, he just said that Eric was a bit of a wallflower at the local dances. He didn't drink much. He wasn't a great pub man, and he, you know, it was a nice meeting. I really enjoyed Jack Denny, and he had an interesting take on, I think, the class structure of the time, because he said that on Sundays, if he was walking along Southwold Promenade, and Eric's father, Richard Blair, would come walking towards him, you know, that even though Eric's father had been in Jack Denny's fitting room, presumably unburdening himself, when they met on the promenade and on a Sunday, Eric, the father, Richard Blair, would walk straight past Jack Denny without a flicker of recognition. So if that's true, then it gives you a bit of an insight into the class structure of the time. I think this gulf between tradesmen and so-called, you know, colonial civil servant, etc. So I found that interesting.
And speaking of Southwold, I think this is Dennis Collins. It's certainly the beach at Southwold. What do you remember of meeting Dennis, who was a friend of Orwell's?
Yeah. Yes, Dennis was curious. He was very forthcoming. He'd been in Mozambique before he came back to Southwold. He and Orwell, Eric Blair, were sort of friends, I guess. And he had a very skeptical take on Eric Blair, his pal Eric. He said, you know, all this stuff about him being poor. You know, he asked for, when he was tramping, he was just out there getting experience. You know, he wasn't poor. He asked me if I would put a return stamp on an envelope or something, and if he'd asked me for money, if he was really down and out, I would have lent him money, etc., etc. He had Dennis. I wasn't quite sure that Dennis. I think he had full control over his mind, but he was off on a jag really about Orwell being obsessed with change. Change, he said, must change. Always must change. If he was in heaven, he would change the order of the angels. And Dennis said, well, you know, speaking as an anthropologist, I think it was all about atonement. I think it was all this tramping was just atoning for all the terrible things he thought he'd done in Burma, which is possibly the case. But Dennis was fun, and he said, oh, when Eric was writing, I said, did you see him writing any of his stuff, the early stuff? He says, no. Just nobody ever saw him writing anything. He just went in his little back room in the morning, and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote, and he didn't care what he wrote about. He was just writing because he needed to get practice in writing. That was Dennis's take on it. So it was a curious interview. I mean, it was skeptical, but very, very, very friendly about Orwell. He was quite intrigued by Orwell or Eric Blair, but also very skeptical. And I walked away thinking, I guess everything he said is true in his own mind. But I was curiously, slightly unsettled actually by the interview with Dennis in a strange way. And parenthetically, Dennis married one of Orwell's early girlfriends, Eleanor Jakes. And that didn't cause any friction between them. He said, no, not at all, no. Wasn't the marrying kind. Eric doesn't merge himself really with other people. I think that's something like he said. So it was interesting.
And then another person who knew Orwell around that time was Mabel Spears. And I think did you meet her and her son?
Yes, Mabel and her son. Oh Lordy, what's his son's name? It's gone.
That's all right.
Yeah, and Mabel. She was lovely, quavering sort of voice, a little bit old, fair enough. And she, of course, described, as she had many times, how she had helped Orwell get published with his first book, and how he was disgusted with having been rejected by publishers and throw the book away, just keep the paper clips, etc. No, she says, I'll help you get it published. And I have friends in London, and so on and so on. What her exact relationship with Eric Blair, George Orwell was, I don't know. She was 10 years older than him, I think, married and living in quite good conditions. I think her husband was probably very well off. Whether there was anything between them, I don't know. I didn't ask, but others have suggested there might have been. And her son, Adrian Fiat, that's right, big booming voice, trying not to take control of the interview with his mother, making sure that his mother was speaking up and saying all the things that she was supposed to say. But Adrian was interesting too, because he was a young boy when Eric was there, and Eric was a hero to Adrian Fiat. He said, when Eric says something, well, it must be true. Eric says this, Eric says that, and as a young boy, he was quite taken with this guy, Eric Blair, and of course he told the story of how the decision to change the name for the pseudonym to Orwell and George. So we know that story. The River Orwell near Southwold.
And then you also visited
yes.
the Hawthorne School where Eric Blair was a master in 1933. And when you found this, again, your photograph, and you found it was a hotel, I gather?
Yep, the Fountain House Hotel. It's two houses put together, I think. And that was the so-called school which Orwell taught in the early 1930s. And there he is looking, I guess, as Jack Denny said, never smart in whatever he was wearing. But I interviewed a man called Jeffrey Stevens, who was a student there. And Jeffrey Stevens was lovely. He described a lot of he gave me a sense of how Orwell was what he knew about nature, and they went on nature walks, and Orwell would point out, they were all prodding the marsh gas in the rivers and the little swamps, and looking at caterpillars and puss moth caterpillars. He said, I always think, every time I see a puss moth caterpillar, I think of Eric Blair, because he introduced us to so many things in nature, and I think that's one of the central wonders. Well, one of Orwell's deepest loves was the natural surroundings of especially England, I think. But Orwell was far from being a benign teacher. He also caned people occasionally. including Jeffrey Stevens, but Jeffrey didn't apparently take it ill. He was still revered Orwell and asked him to tea. And as he said, you wouldn't ask a chap to tea if you didn't admire him, and sort of wonderfully, slightly dated way of talking and way of thinking. But it was a great snapshot of Eric Blair as a teacher when he was trying to make ends meet, and the manuscript of was it Wigan Pier? No, manuscript of Down and Out was mailed. I think he asked Jeffrey Stevens if he would take it to the post office to mail it. So they had an inkling that he was going to be publishing this book.
Speaking of books, this is Book Lovers Corner. I'll skip the audio because people can hear that themselves. We're running a little short on time, but what do you remember about meeting Kay?
Yes, Kay Eckervall. Kay was pretty cagey, I would say, when I first met her. Somewhat suspicious of me, perhaps because she knew she had things to say about Orwell, which were quite critical. Especially when she read The Road to Wigan Pier and his critique of middle-class socialists and his sort of admiration of the physique of the miners and not what they had to say, and the fact that they were joining unions and doing things. She was very much a unionist and very much a working middle-class socialist, I would say. So I think she was quite suspicious of me. But as we got talking, she warmed up and she talked about the fact that they were sort of friends. I'm not sure what exact relationship she had with Orwell. She liked him at first because he was so tall he could reach the top shelves of the bookstore. So she said, "Oh, that's interesting," and he caught her eye. They went on walks in the countryside and talked about authors, and they had so much in common in that regard. So that was, I think, the foundation of their relationship. And again, nature, she said he had what I call country eyes, which I think is a lovely expression. He knew the names of all the trees and all the plants and all the insects and the animals. And she said, "I'm a city girl. I didn't know any of this." So they had a really good relationship on that basis. But when the book came out and the Road to Wigan Pier, that's when she really tore into him in the interview. And I think perhaps she knew that she was going to have to say that kind of thing. And maybe that was why she wasn't terribly excited to meet me at the first moment.
I'm going to speed through a few of these about Wigan. Speaking of that, let's I want to save some time at the end to talk about production. We have an overly ambitious sort of overview of Orwell's life here, but you did go to Wigan. This is again your photo.
Yeah, Sidney Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was the one that took Orwell around Wigan at the beginning. Anyway, he took me around. He showed me the place where on Sovereign Road, where which had been demolished, the house, the tripe shop, Brooker's tripe shop, Sovereign Road. That was all that was left of that particular bit of Wigan. And here we have the back-to-backs, the bricks, the houses which a lot of people lived in and were Orwell lodged in places like that. And there's Wigan Pier. Haha, very funny.
Yeah,
just an old jetty. Yeah. And
then you also met Lydia Jackson, who's also known as Elizabeth.
Yes.
And she's I would suggest people seek out her audio because you can really do hear her Russian accent, and she talks about that, her identity, quite a bit there. What did she think of Eileen?
Yeah, that's the one thing that sticks out of my mind, is that she was very skeptical about the relationship and the marriage. She didn't think that Orwell was a fitting husband for Eileen, and she just said, in her sharp way, I was very sad very sorry that she married George. She was not a fan.
And then that's your recording equipment in the cottage.
Yes.
So you were.
That's the.
Yeah. Why did you go there?
Sorry, go on.
Oh yeah. Why did you go?
I went there. In the cottage in Wallington. I went just obviously to get an inside look at the little stores that Orwell and Eileen had in Wallington. It looked. Esther Brooks was the name of the lady who was renting the place when I was there. And she actually drove me crazy because she said when she got there in 1948, I think it was, after Orwell gave up the lease, she found all kinds of stuff, letters and things, and some of it gone a bit moldy and some of it a bit water stained, and all sorts of bits and pieces of Orwell, and she just burned them. And I thought, how could you do that? How on earth could you do that? But she was just cheerful away. Oh yes, I just had to burn it. But she took me on the tour. That's actually the cassette machine there. That was when I was walking and talking with people. I used that little cassette machine. And when I did a sit-down interview, I used the much bigger reel-to-reel tape machine. But that's what you can see there is the little cassette machine.
And then I think a number of us are interested in Spain. And I know Anna Vaniskaya had a question, as did I. But I think it's fair that you don't remember as much about some of these people. What's this photograph of?
He's my translator. I have his name somewhere, but anyway, he was the guy that helped me translate. And after I'd done all the interviews and I was getting ready to go back to London, he and his wife invited me for a meal, and which was lovely. And he said, here's how we drink out of this porron, P-O-R-R-O-N, I think. And it's quite a shock. Orwell hated those things. He said, I'm never going to drink out of one of those porrons, especially if the wine inside is white wine, because it reminds me of what he called bed bottles. So I think we know what he thinks is what is in his mind. So no, I'm not going to drink that stuff.
And then this is your
Very
photo
skillful.
of Cafe Mocha on the Ramblas, which is important to George Kopp and story.
Yeah, Cafe Mocha, as it was.
And then
skip
looking on for the moment to Preston Hall, and you interviewed Victor Stacy, who had been another TB patient in this sanatorium in 1938.
Yes, he was next. He was in the next cabin to Orwell, and he remembered Orwell's visitors. The discrepancy between the posh ones who came in big cars and what he called the rough boys, or no, he didn't say rough boys, but working class guys who he thought probably had been comrades in Spain. So there was this, he saw this very wide class discrepancy between the people who came to visit Orwell, and there was Victor Stacy was coughing one night, tubercular coughing, and he said Orwell came around and said, very, very concerned, are you all right? Are you all right? And that, he said he was very concerned about the health of his fellow sufferers at Preston Hall, in TB sufferers. Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to actually skip over Mary and Tosco Fivel as much as I'm interested in them, but maybe we'll come back if there's time for questions. And as we know, Orwell worked at the BBC in the 40s. Desmond Hawkins was another journalist who worked with him, who he interviewed. But I want to get to George Woodcock for a second, because he's important to your story. I'm just going to play a clip.
Orwell was the sort of man who was full of grievances. He was very loyal. Once he got to know you, he was extremely loyal. He hated passionately and irrationally. I remember people who were really quite decent people who had still tagged along a bit with the Stalinist bandwagon, and Orwell was full of contempt and fury against them. I fell into a disagreement with him in the Partisan Review over something he said, and I pointed out that after all, he was a former police officer in Burma. He had his phase, he was attacking pacifists. He himself had been a pacifist 1 year before, and this kind of thing. And so I wrote this down, and Orwell wrote a curious reply. And then somehow or other, through an Indian writer called Mulraj Anand, he invited me to take part on his Indian program at the BBC. So I did, and we were very formal. And then I was getting onto a bus up at Hampstead one day, and I saw in front of me a familiar crest of hair. It was Orwell. He'd seen me coming across the street. He turned and patted the seat beside him, so I went up, and he said to me, Woodcock, we may have differences on paper, but that doesn't mean anything derogatory to our relationships as human beings. And with that, our friendship started.
So So you chose George Woodcock to be the narrator of your documentary. We'll get to the technical side of that in a minute, but how did you choose him to
Well, he was really the only choice. In Canada, he was a known broadcaster, and of course he'd written a book on Orwell, and was a personal friend of Orwell. So there was really only one person who would be the narrator of the main 5-hour documentary, and that was George Woodcock. So I went to Vancouver and I met him, and to see how we would get along. And he was fine to do it. He was looking forward to it. He was up for it. Shall I talk about the technical side, Chris? Yes.
Let me just skip through that. We'll get there in 2 seconds.
We'll get to that. Yeah, we'll get to that.
Liam Hunt wanted to know a little bit about your interview with Susan Watson. Is there anything you can add to what's in your book?
Not really. I didn't question her at all about her personal relationship with Orwell. I took it at face value that she was the housekeeper and he was the employer. Whether there was anything more than that, I somehow doubt, frankly, because she had this friendship with doesn't matter.
David Holbrook.
So no, not really. The only thing I would say was that I was really surprised that he didn't tell her he was tubercular. David Holbrook, yes.
You also, sorry.
David Holbrook became her boyfriend. She had this relationship with David Holbrook later on, so that not Orwell.
And then you did interview Richard Blair, our patron of the Orwell Society.
Yes.
Travels.
I did. He was the only person on my list who was my age. Richard was pretty well exactly it, and it was quite a shock. And of course, I was asking him about his experiences at Barn Hill and what it was like to have famous Eric Blair, George Orwell as the father, adopted son, and he said he was very moving. Richard was very moving. He was my father. He said he was my father, although I'd been adopted by him. I can look at Eric Blair and George Orwell and see him from the outside like everybody else does, but other times I see it more from the inside, and yes, he was my father.
And then Richard Keeble wanted to know about Malcolm Muggeridge.
Yes.
New Orwell late in life. Is there anything you can add to that?
The question was, I think, whether Malcolm Muggeridge was just putting it on, whether he was sincere about his love of Orwell, really, and his respect for Orwell. I found him, I know that Muggeridge is a public speaker and is very, very good at putting across, emotions and sincerity. It sounds a bit cynical, but my feeling was very much the opposite, that he was genuinely affectionate towards Orwell and respected Orwell and loved him in a way, yes. And I came away from the interview feeling quite moved, actually. He didn't tell me anything other than that about sending off his archive to another university or anything detailed like that. I didn't even know about that kind of thing. So I just came away from the interview getting a very warm feeling about Orwell from Muggeridge, I enjoyed interviewing Muggeridge. I mean, I had seen him on TV many times, but it was interesting. But in the flesh and talking about Orwell, he was very moving.
And then this is your photograph of Paul Potts at the end of your interview, correct?
Yes, that's right. After the interview, I took him outside to a pub and I bought him a pint because his place was very squalid. He had a very small, squalid little bedsit in London, and it was sad in a way. He was not in good shape in any sense. I mean, he spoke okay, but so I didn't want to photograph him in his place, so I took him outside. What a face. I just was so captivated by that face. It was very noble, I think, that face in a way. Yeah. He was the last person, we think, to see Orwell alive at University College Hospital, leaving this packet of tea outside the door of Orwell's room. And he also said, he said, I think Eileen did love Orwell, and Orwell loved Eileen. And that was another area I was not sure about, what the relationship between Orwell and his wife really was. And it was so hard to get at. But Paul Potts believed that there was real love between them.
And then you also visited Sutton Courtenay, where Orwell's buried.
Yes.
And you were sort of looking for the spirit of Orwell.
Yes, yes. I simply went there because the Reverend Gordon Dunstan had officiated at the funeral in 1950, and I just wanted him to do exactly what he'd done. So I just went into the church and asked him to read those excerpts from the Book of Common Prayer, which the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, which he had done in 1950, and which he did. Again, I just held the microphone, pressed record, and he spoke it. And it was, again, a feeling of communing a bit with Orwell, I think, at that moment. And then we went to the grave, and there was this little rose on it. And Reverend Dunstan we stood there in silence a little bit, as you do in English graveyards, I do anyway, just communing a little bit, thinking and reflecting. There was just this straggly little rose, which apparently Orwell had wanted to grow and freely, and they trimmed it. Trimmed it, yeah.
All right, so we'll quickly finish on a little bit about the production. So your documentary, the 5-hour documentary, which is not currently publicly available, alas, but you were able to sign up the relatively famous actor at the time, Barry Morse, to read Orwell. How did you do that on your budget? Was that difficult?
Yes, well, Barry Morse was way above my budget, but he didn't. He was so keen to play Orwell that he accepted the fee that we had. I discovered he as we got recording, he revealed that he also had tuberculosis as a young man, had also been turned down by the British Army in 1939 because they found a spot on his lung in the medical. He's a working class guy from Shoreditch in East London. So he had this, which I didn't realize, this whole mindset about Orwell. And when it came to the end of the Orwell's demise and was suffering from TB and dying of tuberculosis, Barry went off into the washroom and came back, and his voice was changed. He'd managed to cough up phlegm, apparently, gross though it sounds, and to mimic in a way the sound as he perceived it of a man who might sound as if he was dying of tuberculosis. It was actually quite shocking, but actually quite effective.
And then finally, George Woodcock did come to be your narrator. And if you could quickly talk about what your process was for writing the narration and then what this photograph represents, which is quite interesting.
Yes, the narration had to be tailored very much to the edited clips, because the narration is the flexible part of the jigsaw puzzle of a radio documentary. So I drafted out the links, what needed to be said to get from A to B and B to C and C to D. And then George wrote the narration, of course, and then came into studio later from Vancouver into Toronto, and we sat opposite each other. And I had decided there were two things about George Woodcock that I discovered. Number one, he had a terrible trouble with sibilance, that he had something in some problem with his teeth. I don't know what it was. And there was this whistle that cut through the microphone. And you'll see in the photo, he's holding in his left hand a stick of chewing gum. And I had, I'd never done it before, but I said, the technician, we couldn't solve the problem with all the standard techniques of mic movement. So the last resort, really, because it was hugely endangering of the project if the man who was going to be fronting it all had this awful sibilant sound cutting through the mic. So I said, George, you know, what we normally do in circumstances like this, never having done it before, is you take a bit of chewing gum and sort of gum it down and chew it up a bit and make it soft, you know, yum, 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 and stick it up in the front of your teeth somewhere, because I had no idea which tooth was giving the problem. And so George, bless his heart, 73-year-old writer, went off into the corner of the studio and sort of did what I asked him to do, came back on mic, and we said, oh, can we have a bit more level, please, George? And the technician and I looked at each other. We've done it. We've solved it. Thank God. We can actually we've got there's no sibilance, we can keep going. And I think we got through a couple of sticks of chewing gum in all the evenings of recording, and we finally emerged with a Woodcock voice that we could use over the long haul of a 5-hour documentary. And the gin in his right hand, that was his other prop. He would knock back occasionally, and towards the end he gets a little slurred in the fifth of the episodes in the evenings, and the gin had a little effect, but it helped. So we survived. If it hadn't been for the chewing gum, I think the 5-hour documentary would have been not dead in the water, but what a problem that was. Anyway.
And the other technique you use that you mentioned to me is that typically you might have a narrator read the narration as you wrote it. So you're editing the clips you have, and then you're writing the connective tissue to make the story make sense. But you didn't actually have him read it. You did another technique with him.
No, I didn't. I also discovered that Woodcock was a terrible reader of his own material. He was flat as a pancake. And I decided another technique, which I hadn't used before, was to interview him on the agreed material. So I would say, okay, this is here's what has to be said. Look down at what you've written, and then I would say, now look at me and tell me in your own words what you've written there. And luckily, I mean, again and again and again and again, over 20 hours, I was interviewing him, asking him, prodding him with these setup questions, and trying to knock him off course just slightly so that he had to think a little, but not so much that he was knocked off track and couldn't remember what he needed to say. So this technique of interviewing for a narrative track, I sort of used it for the first time as a last resort with Woodcock, because again, a 5-hour documentary, when the narrator is speaking as woodenly as George did, but as beautifully when he's telling a story, that was the trick that liberated the real Woodcock for this 5-hour show. Otherwise, again, it would have been much less powerful. So yeah, tricks that you learn or just make up as you go along.
All right. Well, Steve, it's all right with your permission, I will end us there and see if there's time for some questions. Thank you for joining us, everybody.
Yeah.
There's many more stories that Steve has, as you probably imagine and see. So,
well, thank you very much, both of you. I'm sure that everybody else found that as fascinating as I did. Could only wish we could maybe invite you back another time. I don't know. It was brilliant. You mentioned such with the joys. There's recently been published a cartoon version, I'm sure that's not the right description, but I think you'll know what I mean, of such with the joys. We will have a program which is open to members and a wider audience on November the 7th, where the two people who created both the words and drawings for that will be hosted by the Orwell Society. And you will in due course get an invitation from Neil. So one other quick thing before we go on. Yesterday, Richard and Eleanor and Liz and I were the guests at All Saints Sutton Courtenay with many other people who were there for the dedication of the extension, which those of you who've been coming to Sutton Courtenay over the years and have put your hand in your pocket to help raise the money for, eventually costing about $750,000. They've now got a wonderful facility attached to the church that we were privileged to be invited to the opening of. So that was splendid. You've very well covered many of the questions that people had pre-submitted. Could I, on your behalf, Richard Keeble, if you are with us, ask, do you have any insight, Steve, about why Muggeridge withdrew from writing the biography?
Quentin, it's Neil here. I think we've lost Steve, hopefully temporarily.
Oh, right.
So his video went and then he went.
Yeah.
So I just hope he's trying to get back in. As soon as he appears in the waiting room, I'll let him in.
Right. Do you have any insight on that, Chris?
I do.
I don't, so I'm going to hand it over to Peter.
May I?
Yes, please, Peter.
My understanding is that Sonia commissioned Muggeridge as a way of forestalling a biography.
Exactly.
That she knew that he would never do it, and if other people, such as myself or others, came along and said we want to do a biography, she could then say no. Malcolm Muggeridge is doing it. So I think it was never thought that he would really do it. But might I just ask a question and say a little more? I don't think there's any question that Orwell had affairs with Eleanor Jacks, Mabel Spears, and certainly when we interviewed Kay Eckerval, he said, I think Kay in many ways was his first most serious relationship. I think the other relationships were well, I think they were serious, but was seen as short term. And I wonder if anything, I think the relationship with Dennis Collins was perhaps quite complex, in the sense it's my impression that Orwell was continuing his affair with Eleanor Jacks when she and Dennis were already engaged, which seems to me would make it a little more complex. That it sounded as if it was a later development. But the question I would also have, whether it came up with Dennis Collins. Collins was studying anthropology at Cambridge, and I think he was influenced by Malinowski's idea of being a participant observer, and whether he told Orwell about that, because obviously in Down and Out, and particularly as a tramp, Orwell was very much being a participant observer, and whether he was thought of doing that because of his conversations with Dennis Collins. And I'm curious whether that sort of thing came up. And I look forward to I'll go onto the website and try to acquire the tapes of the interviews.
Oh, he's gone again. I was about to ask Norrie to ask his question, but Norrie, we're a little bit stuck at the moment because Steve's flitting in and out.
And I can say one. Oh, here he comes again. Great. Let's see if we can admit him. I will say that he definitely Steve mentioned to me in our conversations getting ready for this, that Dennis Collins did view things through an anthropological point of view, as was his training, and saw what Orwell was doing as anthropology of sorts, of going down and out. So that definitely came up, and again, in the book and in the interviews, that definitely is present.
Well, I think in the hello, Steve, are you back?
Yes, I'm sorry. I think the iPad ran out of power. I plugged it in and I'm back.
Oh, lovely. Good old electricity. Great. Norrie,
I'm holding it back.
Well, just before I ask Norrie the question, Peter, I think the relatively recent discoveries of Jake's letter collection certainly confirms your view that she was having simultaneous relationships before she decided that Dennis was a more suitable long-term companion. Norrie, would you like to ask Steve a question?
Yeah, I've been reviewing Rebecca Solnit's new book, Orwell's Roses, for the Orwell Society Journal. And I wanted to ask Steve, particularly in the light of his interview with Jeffrey Stevens, how important would he say that Orwell's love of nature was for Orwell's whole life and his work, indeed?
From my opinion, very important, very, very important. It comes across very much in Jeffrey Stevens's interview. That's one of the main things he remembers is Orwell's, as I said, the nature, the the teachings he gave and the walks he did, the experiments he did, and I think, you know, it permeates so much of Orwell's writing. I mean, going out with Julia into the countryside in 1984, the sort of virgin countryside, the place where you're safe, the place that's, and then be asked to being buried in an English churchyard. You know, this I think he was conservative in everything except his politics, and it was love of the English countryside and what it represented as an enduring, something solid and enduring, in a way similar perhaps to the Canadian North. People think of the North as being this thing that's, you know, it's untouchable and it's always there, and you can rely on it no matter what vicissitudes life throws at you. And maybe the countryside and the English countryside had the same resonance for all.
Just a supplementary, did other people mention his love of nature? For example, people on Jura?
It seems to me it probably did. I think it was, he loved the earth and nature, things, tangible nature.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Rebecca, of course, will be talking about her book to us in the November George Talk. And for those of you who are relatively new members, some of the George Talks we open, invite members to invite friends to sign up for, and Rebecca's is one of those. So the November George Talk will be Rebecca talking about the book that Norrie mentioned. Who would like to ask another question? Richard Keeble, did you want to ask anything more of Steve?
No, it's fine. Richard Blair has his hand up.
Oh, he does. So he does. Rick, please.
Nice. Good evening. Good evening, Steve. Nice to talk to you.
Yes, nice to see you again.
Nice, indeed. What I'm going to ask is, in fact, when you interviewed Jacintha, when she spoke to you, did she mention the fact that she had a baby during the time that when Orwell was away in Burma, and which was why she wouldn't talk to him when he came back from Burma and furthered. So it's interesting that was that why she rejected him, and when she spoke to him, or didn't speak to him, when she wrote to him when he was in Cranham, that she felt she wasn't going to speak to him ever again, or go and see him. Was she washed of him?
Well, she didn't mention to me anything about the baby. Nothing at all. That's news to me. When he came back from Burma, the reason she didn't get in touch with him, she told me, was that her auntie had said, you know, she'd met this guy coming back, and he wasn't at all like the young man that went out to Burma, and you wouldn't like him much now. Auntie Lillian, I believe her name was. So I guess that was possibly a reason why she didn't, one of the reasons maybe why she didn't re-establish contact with Eric Blair when he came back from Burma. But later on in life at Cranham, no, what she said to me is what I said, that she just couldn't. Well, he had written letters to her, hadn't he, saying, you know, I'd love to see you again, and I have this adopted boy. And she said, I didn't want to think that I could be a mother to his adopted child. And you know, and then of course there was the business about hating the book, 1984. So I guess it all added up to a decision not to get back in touch, which she did regret, I think.
Yes, well, of course, this was the appendix to written by Diony Venables, who researched this, to the book that Jacintha wrote back many years ago in a book called Eric and Us, and it explained why she had rejected my father, because she felt so. She had a problem with her conscience that she had had a baby. That the reason being, of course, was that she had would have wanted to have had a baby with my father, but she was not ready for it. And when she was ready, he wasn't there, and she had a baby with somebody else, and she couldn't reconcile the two.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Anna Baniskaya, would you like to ask Steve a question more specifically about Spain than the general comment that you returned to Neil? If you could unmute yourself.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for that. My question was in fact quite general. It was to see whether you remembered anything more about your interviews with the various people who knew Orwell in Spain. So the people who served with him, obviously John McNair. And I was curious about Victor Alba because he became an authority on the Spanish Civil War afterwards. And his memory of his encounter with Orwell was not particularly complimentary. So I was just curious if you could remember anything about any of those people.
Well, John McNair, of course, was dead long before I started my interview, so there was no interview with him. I don't remember much about Victor Alba, to be honest, except that, as you know, he didn't think much of Orwell at the time, but then when he read Homage to Catalonia, he thought it was a wonderful book. And yes, I didn't know that he'd become an expert in the Civil War. Yeah, as for the others, well, there were so many of his former comrades. The in England, I guess the one that sticks out most was the interview with Sam Lesser, or I think his real name was Russell. I think he just inverted the name, but he was very sticky. He was not a pal of Orwell, as you know. He was, in fact, as the interview went on, he got spikier and spikier, and even after all those years later, 1983 to 1936, 37, he was still furious with Orwell, I could tell. And I sort of felt that he's almost not exactly frothing at the mouth, but as the interview went on, he got more and more worked up about his dislike of Orwell and how what he'd written and what he read is about the Communist Party and how POUM had been suppressed, etc., etc., etc. So that was the interview that I remember most. But there were so many. I mean, the other colleagues that the other ones were very interesting about Orwell's life and time in Spain. But there were quite a few, so I'm not sure which one to speak about. But Lesser was the one I remember the most.
Thank you, Dione. I'm sorry, I couldn't see you putting your hand up. Please, would you like to ask Steve your question or make your comment? Dione, are you there? Have you unmuted yourself?
Unmute. Am I now unmuted?
We can hear you now, Dione, yeah.
I was going to, hello, Steve. I was
Hello.
going to say to you that a conversation with Jacintha said that the reason that she didn't at first want to go and visit George at Cranham was because he mentioned Richard. And as she had lost her own baby, or rather her own child was being brought up as her cousin because adopted by our aunt, she couldn't face the idea of taking on somebody else's child. And that was from her own mouth.
That's fascinating, Dione. Thank you.
Yes. I didn't know anything about that.
Oh, well, we can talk after and I'll tell you all about it. We've also got another member
Yes.
who is the last Buddicom, who is Jennifer Buddicom, who is Jennifer Brown now, and she is the very last Buddicom and came from Tickleton and still lives there. So, you know, she's an interesting person to try these sort of things.
Yes,
Steve, perhaps you
it's
can,
very, very interesting.
yeah. And Steve, perhaps you can talk about what it, you know, from your point of view, what it's like to go in and interview these people in their homes as a journalist, and what does that change the interview and how generous these people were to sort of let you into their lives?
No, for me, it was sad to say I had such limited time with these people, just an hour or maybe 2 at the most. And so, you know, the job is really to get on record, on tape in a most conversational and powerful way as possible. And what I kind of knew they already said. If I had unlimited time and money and I could have revisited and formed a relationship with some of the interviewees, it's possible that as we developed more trust and they realized that there was more depth that I was looking for, maybe they would have volunteered other things, which, you know, especially what we just mentioned, the one about Jacintha, things like that, or else, but you never know unless you have other outside information that you can use to fuel the interview. I mean, you only know as a journalist what they're going to tell you. If you don't have an outside interview to other material to say, well, yes, but here in another place, another time, you said this, or you went there, or you did this, you know, and that kind of extra knowledge I didn't normally have because it was so quick having to interview 75 people in such a short space of time, which is a shame. But that's just the nature of the beast, you know, so there it is.
I think the important thing is that you captured something that nobody else did. Such a wide range of people, not just the Malcolm Muggeridges of this world. Lots of people giving little insights that wouldn't have been available to anybody otherwise. I think that's so important. I think we should formally draw the recording to an end now, and thank you. If everybody could unmute and say thank you to Steve and Chris, who are happy to stay on for a little while longer for any informal chats as we normally have. So if we could all unmute and say thank you, I'd be grateful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah.
Thank you.